Before we dive in, tell me where you're listening from and what pulled you into this story. If it spoke to you, drop a comment. Your words help keep history's forgotten voices alive. The throne room is silent, but it is not empty. Incense curls upward in slow, deliberate spirals, as if even the smoke knows better than to move too quickly here. Silk screens divide the room, not to hide weakness, but to concentrate power. Behind one of them sits a woman history insists on calling a shadow, a dowager, a relic, a mistake, and yet every official kneels in her direction. You don't see her at first, that's the point. In Qing China, visibility was never the same as authority. Emperors sat on thrones, generals marched at the front of armies, men shouted orders and signed decrees in thick black ink. But real power, durable power, learned to breathe quietly. For 47 years, China answered to a woman who was never supposed to rule at all. Her name was Cixi. The West would later call her the Dragon Lady, dripping the title with fear and disdain. Reformers would accuse her of strangling progress. Historians would flatten her into a caricature, cruel, vain, backward, obsessed with control while an empire crumbled around her. But caricatures are what you draw when the truth makes you uncomfortable, because the truth is this: when the Qing dynasty was bleeding from 1,000 wounds, foreign powers carving China into concessions, rebellions ripping through the countryside, corruption rotting the court from within, Cixi was not the chaos, she was the containment. And to understand how a woman became the most powerful figure in China without ever being crowned empress, you have to go back before the throne, before the screens, before the whispers of poison and paranoia. You have to go back to a girl who was never meant to matter. She was born in 1835 into the Yehanara clan, a respectable Manchu family, but not a powerful one. The kind of family that survived on proximity to greatness rather than possession of it. Well-bred, well-mannered, quietly anxious about slipping into obscurity. Her given name was Xingjun. History would rename her many times, but at the beginning she was simply another daughter in a world that treated daughters as temporary residents. Girls were raised knowing their value would be determined elsewhere, by marriage, by obedience, by how well they vanished into another household's expectations. The Qing court was not looking for brilliance in its women. It was looking for compliance. At 16, Xingjun was selected to enter the Forbidden City as a concubine, not a wife, not even a favored companion. One among dozens, young women chosen for their beauty, their silence, their ability to exist without leaving fingerprints. The Forbidden City did not glitter the way outsiders imagined. It watched, it measured, it punished mistakes quietly and rewarded patience even more quietly. Every gesture was noted, every word overheard, every alliance provisional. This was a place where women learned quickly that survival depended on reading the room before the room realized it was being read. And Xingjun learned fast. She observed how attention worked, how emperors tired of noise but remembered restraint, how servants heard everything, how favor could be lost overnight, and how invisibility, when used correctly, could become a shield. Then she did something no one had planned for. She gave birth to a son. In a palace crowded with ambition and infertility, this changed everything. The emperor, Xianfeng, had few surviving heirs. Suddenly, the quiet concubine from an unremarkable clan was no longer replaceable. She was necessary. Motherhood in the imperial court was not sentimental, it was strategic. A woman's influence expanded and contracted with her child's importance, and Xingjun understood immediately what her son represented. Not love, leverage. She watched as the court recalibrated around her, how officials bowed a fraction deeper, how rival concubines hardened their smiles, how the future began to lean, subtly, in her direction. She did not rush, she did not boast, she did not mistake opportunity for safety, because she already understood the most dangerous truth of power in Qing China. The moment people noticed you mattered, they started planning how to remove you. And Xingjun, soon to be known as Cixi, had no intention of disappearing quietly. She was still young, still officially powerless, still expected to remain grateful and silent. But inside the Forbidden City, the machine was already shifting, and the girl who entered as a concubine was beginning to understand how empires really worked, not through titles, but through timing. The emperor was dying. Xianfeng had fled Beijing as foreign troops marched closer, retreating to the imperial hunting lodge at Rehe like a man hoping distance might stop history. It didn't. By the summer of 1861, the Qing emperor was sick, exhausted, humiliated by military defeat, and painfully aware that his dynasty was slipping out of his hands, and his heir was 5 years old. A child emperor is not a solution. He is a vacuum, one that ambitious men rush to fill. When Xianfeng died, the court moved fast, too fast. A group of senior officials, 8 regents handpicked by the emperor himself, took control of the government on behalf of the boy emperor, Tongji. On paper, it looked orderly, responsible, patriarchal, men managing affairs until the child grew into his role. In reality, it was a seizure. The regents controlled the seals, the documents, the flow of information. They issued edicts in the emperor's name while ensuring the emperor himself, 5 years old, frightened, and malleable, never actually governed. And the women of the court, they were expected to mourn, to sit behind curtains, to obey. Cixi did none of that. She was now Empress Dowager, the mother of the emperor. By tradition, she should have faded into ceremonial silence, offered advice only when asked, trusted the men to run the empire. But Cixi understood something the regents did not. Power doesn't belong to the person holding the seal. It belongs to the person everyone needs to legitimize it. And the child emperor needed her. So did the court. So did the dynasty. She began quietly, the way she always did, listening, asking questions that sounded harmless, aligning herself with the other Empress Dowager Cian, the emperor's official mother by rank, but not by blood. The regents underestimated this alliance immediately. 2 women, both confined by tradition, both expected to be pliable. That miscalculation would end them. Cixi studied the regents' weaknesses with surgical precision, their arrogance, their infighting, their habit of treating imperial women as decorative obstacles rather than political actors. She let them believe she was afraid, let them believe she needed their protection. Then she moved. In what would later be called the Xinyu coup, Cixi and Cian struck with speed that shocked the court. Using the authority of the emperor's mother, they issued edicts accusing the regents of corruption, abuse of power, and betrayal of imperial trust. Loyal officials were mobilized. Arrests followed almost immediately. Some regents were executed, others were forced to commit suicide, all were removed, and overnight the narrative flipped. The women behind the curtain were now ruling the empire. Cixi didn't claim the throne. She didn't sit in public on the dragon seat. She ruled from behind the screen, a ritualized compromise that preserved the illusion of male authority while consolidating real power in her hands. Every decree passed through her. Every appointment required her approval. Every policy bent, subtly or sharply, to her will. To her critics, this was manipulation. To her supporters, it was stabilization. To the Qing dynasty, it was survival. Because without Cixi, the empire would have fallen into factional chaos the moment Xianfeng died. The regents had no popular support, no flexibility, and no plan beyond maintaining control. Cixi had all 3. She ruled not as an idealist, but as a realist. She understood that China was no longer the uncontested center of the world. Foreign powers pressed at every border. Internal rebellions simmered constantly. The court was bloated, corrupt, and brittle. This was not a system you could reform gently. It was one you had to manage ruthlessly. And Cixi managed it. The child emperor grew up knowing who truly governed. Ministers learned where decisions were actually made. Foreign envoys quickly realized that negotiations succeeded or failed based on one woman's approval. The Dragon Lady myth would come later. The accusations of cruelty, vanity, and paranoia would pile up with time. But in this moment, this pivot point, Cixi was something far less theatrical and far more dangerous. She was competent, and in a world where women were never supposed to rule, competence was unforgivable. because now China was not being ruled by accident. It was being ruled by a woman who had learned very early on that power never announces itself. It simply takes over. By the time Cixi had consolidated power, the story around her had already begun to rot, not because of what she did, but because of who she was. A woman ruling an empire of men is unsettling enough. A woman ruling it well, that demands an explanation people can live with, and competence for a woman like Cixi was not an acceptable one. So the myth began. Western diplomats described her as manipulative, cruel, decadent. They wrote about poisonings whispered through silk screens, about executions ordered with a flick of her wrist, about a court paralyzed by fear of an aging concubine obsessed with her own survival. Chinese reformers echoed similar themes, framing her as a tyrant who strangled progress to preserve her grip on power. The label stuck, Dragon Lady. It was a convenient image, exotic, sinister, gendered. It transformed a political operator into a caricature, half seductress, half monster. And once that story took hold, everything she did could be filtered through it. If she approved a reform, it was manipulation. If she delayed one, it was ignorance. If she removed an official, it was cruelty. If she spared one, it was favoritism. Male emperors who purged rivals were decisive. Cixi, doing the same, was hysterical. But look closer, and the myth starts to crack. Cixi inherited a court that was already riddled with corruption, paralyzed by tradition, and terrified of change. The Qing bureaucracy was bloated with officials who bought their positions, resisted accountability, and treated reform as a personal threat. Every attempt to modernize threatened someone's livelihood, status, or power base. And Cixi knew something the reformers often didn't. Reform without stability is not progress, it's collapse. She did not oppose change because she hated it. She opposed uncontrolled change because she had watched empires fracture under it. This was the paradox of her rule. She authorized military modernization, shipyards, telegraph lines, and limited industrial reforms. She allowed Western technology to enter China, but under supervision, not surrender. She backed the self-strengthening movement not out of enthusiasm for the West, but out of recognition that China could not remain frozen in time. What she refused to do was dismantle the entire system overnight to satisfy idealists who underestimated how fragile the empire already was. That refusal would haunt her, especially when it came to the young emperor, Guangxu. He was not her son, but her nephew. A boy emperor raised under her shadow, educated in reformist ideas, impatient with tradition, and desperate to prove himself. By the 1890s, Guangxu believed China could only survive by transforming itself rapidly: constitutional monarchy, Western-style education, bureaucratic overhaul. The 100 Days reform was his gamble, and it terrified Cixi, not because it threatened her personally, but because it threatened to tear the empire apart. The reforms were sweeping, abrupt, and poorly supported by the officials who would have to implement them. Opposition was fierce, resistance was immediate. The court was splitting into hostile factions. Cixi watched the momentum build and saw something familiar, a vacuum, the same kind that had followed Xianfeng's death, the same kind ambitious men always rushed to fill, the same kind that foreign powers exploited mercilessly. So she intervened. Guangxu was placed under house arrest. Reformers were executed or exiled. The 100 Days ended not with renewal, but with blood. History would later call this proof of her backwardness. But backwardness doesn't explain her timing. She acted when chaos loomed, not when reform became possible. She did what she had always done, chose control over collapse, containment over catastrophe. The problem was, by now, the world wanted a villain. Foreign powers needed someone to blame for China's resistance. Reformers needed someone to blame for their failure. And historians, especially male ones, needed a cautionary tale. Cixi fit perfectly. She was older now, more isolated, more cautious, and the myths hardened around her like armor she never asked to wear. But the empire was not static. Pressure continued to mount, from railways slicing through sacred land, from missionaries undermining local authority, from treaties that humiliated China on the world stage. And soon a rebellion would erupt that would make everything worse, the Boxer Rebellion. And when that fire burned, Cixi would be blamed not just for survival, but for the empire's sins. Because when history cannot forgive a woman for holding power, it makes sure she carries the weight of everything that went wrong. By the turn of the 20th century, China was no longer merely under pressure. It was under siege. Foreign powers had carved the Qing Empire into zones of influence like a carcass laid out on a table. Railways cut through farmland without consent. Missionaries arrived with Bibles backed by gunboats. Unequal treaties stripped China of tariffs, sovereignty, dignity. Each concession bled authority from the throne and poured resentment into the countryside. And resentment does not stay quiet. In northern China, it curdled into something volatile. They called themselves the Yihetuan, righteous and harmonious fists. To foreigners, they would become the Boxers. Young men, farmers, laborers, displaced by drought, debt, and humiliation. They trained in martial rituals, believed themselves spiritually protected from bullets, and preached a furious gospel. China must be purged of foreign influence. They burned churches. They attacked missionaries. They murdered Chinese Christians seen as collaborators. At first, the Qing court dismissed them as superstitious peasants, dangerous but manageable. Cixi did not. She recognized the signs immediately. This was not just rebellion. This was desperation weaponized by belief. And belief, once ignited, spreads faster than armies. The court split. One faction urged suppression, crush the Boxers before foreign powers used them as an excuse for invasion. Another whispered a different strategy. Redirect the fire. Aim it outward. Let the Boxers bleed the foreigners instead of the dynasty. Cixi hesitated. This moment, more than any other, would define her legacy. She knew the risk. Supporting the Boxers meant gambling against the combined military might of Europe, Japan, and the United States. It meant trusting chaos to serve order, but opposing them meant alienating millions of furious Chinese who already believed the Qing had become puppets of the West. And here is the uncomfortable truth historians often dodge. Cixi did not create the Boxer Rebellion. She inherited it. She was choosing between two catastrophes and trying to survive the less lethal one. When foreign troops began to mobilize anyway, when demands escalated, when threats poured in, Cixi made her choice. She backed the Boxers. Imperial edicts were issued, foreign legations were besieged in Beijing, the court declared war on the foreign powers. For a brief, furious moment, it looked like defiance. Then reality arrived. The Eight-Nation Alliance responded with overwhelming force. Troops marched on Beijing, cities fell, civilians were slaughtered, looting was rampant, executions were casual. The Forbidden City, the symbolic heart of the empire, was suddenly vulnerable, and Cixi fled. Disguised as a peasant, traveling by cart, the woman who had ruled China for decades escaped her own capital as foreign armies marched in triumph. The image would become legend, the Dragon Lady humbled, exposed, running. But even in defeat, Cixi did not surrender the throne. From exile she negotiated, she conceded, she survived. The Boxer Protocol that followed was brutal, crippling indemnities, foreign troops stationed permanently in Beijing, humiliations stacked atop humiliation. China was punished not just for rebellion, but for daring to resist at all. And once again, the story simplified itself. Cixi became the villain of global history. Western newspapers painted her as irrational, barbaric, bloodthirsty, a woman whose superstition doomed her country. Reformers blamed her for aligning with the Boxers instead of crushing them. Later, historians would point to this moment as proof that she was the obstacle to modern China. But this version of events erases something essential. Foreign powers had already decided China was weak. They had already decided to intervene. They had already decided to extract whatever they could. The Boxer Rebellion did not cause the invasion, it justified it. Cixi's greatest crime, in the eyes of history, was not cruelty. It was miscalculation. She gambled on rage and lost. And in doing so, she became the perfect scapegoat for an empire collapsing under pressures no single ruler male or female, could have contained. After the flames died down, something strange happened. Cixi changed. The woman who had once restrained reform now embraced it. And that pivot, too late for some, but radical nonetheless, would complicate her legacy in ways most people never hear about. Because the final years of her rule were not defined by stagnation, they were defined by transformation. After the Boxer catastrophe, something in Cixi shifts, not softly, not sentimentally, strategically. She returns to Beijing in 1902 not as a humbled relic, but as a woman who has just stared into the abyss and decided she will not let the empire collapse on her watch, no matter what version of herself she has to become to stop it. Here is the part that unsettles people. Cixi becomes a reformer, not in whispers, in policy. She authorizes sweeping changes that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. The ancient civil service examinations, based on Confucian classics memorized by rote for over 1,000 years, are abolished. In their place, modern schools, Western science, mathematics, engineering, military academies. Girls' education is encouraged. Yes, girls. The same woman accused of freezing China in tradition now supports schools for women, sending the first cracks through centuries of enforced domestic silence. Foot binding, long tolerated, sometimes encouraged, is publicly condemned. New legal codes begin replacing imperial custom. Provincial assemblies are proposed. A constitutional monarchy is openly discussed. Even the army is reorganized along modern lines. This is not cosmetic reform, it is systemic triage, and it raises an uncomfortable question historians don't love answering. If Cixi was truly allergic to modernization, why did it happen under her authority? The answer isn't redemption, it's realism. Cixi understood something many idealists did not. Reform without control is revolution, and revolution devours dynasties. So she moved not out of moral awakening, but survival instinct sharpened into governance. Critics argue it was too late. And they're not wrong. The empire was exhausted. Foreign debt strangled the treasury. Revolutionary sentiment had already escaped the bottle. Sun Yat-sen's ideas were spreading faster than decrees could contain. But too late is not the same as nothing. The truth is more unsettling than either praise or condemnation. Cixi was adapting faster than the system she ruled. She was trying to modernize an empire while keeping it imperial, rewiring the house while it was already on fire. And then, in 1908, the clock runs out. Within days of each other, 2 deaths shake China. First, the Guangxu emperor, long a prisoner, finally dying under circumstances that still raise eyebrows. Then, almost immediately after, Cixi. She dies at 72, having ruled China, directly or indirectly, for nearly half a century. The Qing dynasty collapses 3 years later, and history, eager for a villain, seals her reputation. She becomes the Dragon Lady, the tyrant, the woman who held China back. A convenient story, but incomplete, because empires don't fall because of one woman. They fall because centuries of pressure finally exceed what any ruler, male or female, can contain. Cixi didn't end imperial China. She was its last functional spine. And that leaves us with the most dangerous question of all. Was she the reason China failed to modernize sooner? Or the only reason it survived as long as it did? That question, uncomfortable, unresolved, is where her story refuses to end. And that's exactly why she still matters. After Cixi's death, the Qing dynasty collapses like a structure already hollowed out from the inside. Revolutionaries declare a republic, emperors become museum exhibits, and suddenly China needs an explanation simple enough to fit on a pamphlet. So they choose her. Because history loves a single face for complex failure, and it especially loves a woman it can blame. Western journalists, missionaries, and diplomats rush to write the final chapter, and they write it with venom. They describe her as decadent, manipulative, cruel beyond reason. A scheming concubine who poisoned emperors, sabotaged progress, and ruled through superstition and spite. The phrase Dragon Lady enters the global imagination, a caricature more than a person, exotic, tyrannical, sexualized, dangerous. Notice the pattern. Male emperors who lost wars were tragic. Male reformers who failed were idealists. Male generals who brutalized civilians were products of their time. But Cixi? She was unnatural. Her crime wasn't just political failure, it was authority without apology. Western writers couldn't reconcile a woman who ruled without softness, without maternal gentleness, without Western-approved femininity, so they translated her power into monstrosity. They wrote about her wardrobe, her appetite, her supposed cruelty in gossip-heavy detail, things rarely emphasized when chronicling male rulers. Chinese revolutionaries weren't kinder. To build a new China, they needed the old one to look rotten. Cixi became the perfect symbol, the woman who clung to the past, the final obstacle before progress. Blaming her allowed them to sidestep deeper truths, foreign exploitation, internal corruption, systemic decay that long predated her birth. And so the myth hardened. Cixi as poisoner, Cixi as tyrant, Cixi as the woman who ruined China. But here's what rarely makes it into the simplified version. She ruled longer than almost any leader in modern Chinese history. She held together an empire already being carved up by global powers. She navigated court politics that killed men twice her size before breakfast. She outlived emperors, rebellions, invasions, and reformers alike. And she did it without the luxury of being called a visionary when things went right, or misunderstood when they went wrong. History didn't judge Cixi neutrally. It used her. Because if the fall of a civilization can be pinned on one woman, the rest of the world gets to sleep easier. And that is the most dangerous legacy of all. Here is the truth history dances around but never quite says out loud. Empress Dowager Cixi did not fail because she was weak. She survived because she was strong in ways people found unsettling. She ruled for 47 years in a system designed to erase women the moment they became inconvenient. She navigated an empire being hollowed out by foreign powers, internal rot, and technological upheaval no single ruler, man or woman, could have stopped. And when the structure finally collapsed, history did what it always does in moments of chaos. It found a woman to blame. Cixi violated the most dangerous rule in power. She refused to disappear quietly. She didn't rule as a placeholder. She didn't apologize for authority. She didn't soften her decisions to make them more palatable, and that made her unforgivable. Psychologically, figures like Cixi become vessels. They absorb collective anxiety, fear about decline, fear about change, fear that systems built by men are not as stable as they pretend to be. When those systems crack, the woman closest to the throne becomes the story people tell themselves so they don't have to look deeper. Cixi became a warning instead of a case study, a myth instead of a mirror. But if you strip away the caricature, if you look at her not as a symbol, but as a strategist, you see something far more unsettling. She adapted, she endured, she governed in impossible conditions, she modernized selectively, not because she was ignorant, but because she understood something reformers often forget. Change without control is collapse. She didn't fear the future. She feared chaos, and history has a habit of mistaking restraint for ignorance when it comes from women. Today, the pattern hasn't changed. Powerful women are still described as cold instead of focused, strategic instead of calculating, ruthless instead of decisive. And when things go wrong, their competence is questioned in ways men's never are. So was Empress Dowager Cixi a villain? Or was she simply a woman who played a brutal game better than the people who later rewrote the rules? Because here's the final irony. China didn't fall because of Cixi. Cixi survived because China was already falling. And history, uncomfortable with that truth, needed her to be something simpler, a dragon. But dragons, after all, are not symbols of destruction in Chinese culture. They are symbols of power, survival, and rule. And Empress Dowager Cixi ruled until the very end. Not because she was allowed to, but because she refused anything else.
And that's where we leave her. On the page, in the archive, in the rumor, in the shadow she carved into history. Maybe she was a villain. Maybe she was a victim. Maybe she was something far more dangerous, a woman who refused the role she was handed. But one thing is certain, the world wasn't ready for her then, and it still isn't now. If you enjoyed falling down this rabbit hole of power, defiance, and the women history tried to bury, make sure you're here for the next chapter, because there are more of them, more rebels, more survivors, more legends disguised as scandals. Until next time, keep questioning the stories you were told, and keep an eye on the women they warned you about.